welcome everybody for the last talk of the evening. Klemens is here to talk about the visual language of board games, analog games. I guess, I don't know how many of you play board games regularly? Then I guess you probably have some games that he illustrated in your cupboard. So without further ado, I give you Klemens.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, it sounds like that. I have to use the microphone because we're recording the session. Well, thank you for inviting me here. When Rudy contacted me, he asked if I would talk about board game illustration and as well on the topic of digital painting and stuff like that. And I responded to him. I think there are people more capable and more competent on that topic, but I would love to talk about the visual language of board games, how board games try to talk to us, how they use what they have to communicate with the players. A quick introduction, probably. Klemens, Franz is my name. I'm from Austria and I do board game graphics and board game illustrations for 13 years now, and I've worked on about 300 games, expansions included, of course. So when talking about visuals in board games, this picture is one of the earliest examples of an arrow. I'll move here. An arrow used for something different than picturing and highlighting the war and fight. It was one of the, or it is one of the earliest examples where an arrow depicts a direction. So that's why I like to take this picture always in the beginning, because it illustrates how icons, how visuals are changing over the course of time. The problem we have with board games is that the medium itself, hidden behind the plant, there is a sentence, is not responding. We have paper, we have cardboard, we have wood, we have probably some plastic pieces, but they are not responding in a way digital devices do, for example. So if we look at the whole field of user interaction design, we always have a medium that is reacting automatically to the input of the user, the input of the player, the people playing the game. We don't have this in board games, and that's really, that's a strength and a weakness. So I have to step outside and take a look at the bigger picture. There above in the center or in the corner you see Aki Järvinen, Games Without Frontiers. He's a Finnish games researcher, and he created a systemic approach to describing games. It's not a definition of game, it's more a framework, a systemic framework of components that work together to create a game. And the strength of this model is that it's not focused on board games or digital games, it's focused on the action of playing, the action of gaming itself. And he identifies different elements in that system, and the one I need to highlight when we're talking about board games are the procedures. You see them: rules, mechanics, procedures. Games have rules, games have mechanics, and games have procedures. Procedures are things that players have to do even though they are not part of the rules system, they are not part of the game. For example, if you have to shuffle the cards before you deal them, that's procedure. If you have to take the die and roll it to determine a number, it's a procedure. So those procedures are not really part of the game, but they are needed to make the game flow. Digital games are really good at handling those procedures. They handle them in the background. They calculate the outcome of an attack in a role-playing game. They move the spaceship in a shoot-'em-up in real time. Board games don't have that. So we, as the players, have to execute those procedures. And when it's when we talk about the language of board games and interacting with board games, we always have to keep in mind that players have to execute those procedures. I'll come back to them a little bit later. Okay, so here once again we have non-responsive material, and the thing with board games, with analog games, is that we don't have really research or literature when talking about it. So every board game, every analog game, the designers, the illustrators, the graphic designers are inventing a new language. They are inventing a new set of symbols. They are inventing a new set of how things and how procedures and how the game flow is pictured in the game. So the only thing we can do if we want to look at literature and things that have been already discovered, we have to look at different things and different medias that are also not responsive in the way digital devices are. We can look at how people are reading comics. Comics do have a visual language, and that's a thing that's documented quite extensively, is probably too much, but there is literature. We can even look at how it is reading a book. Reading a book is not just a one-way thing, because we have to turn pages, because we have to know the language. We have to have the ability to read the words, connect them to sentences, and let those sentences create pictures in our head. If the book has an index, we have to know how the index works. We have to know that if there's a number next to the caption of a capital, then we can turn to that page. So books are in some way interactive as well. And we have to look at things like print, layout, wayfinding, and some of them I'm going to touch a little bit later. And we have to talk about semiotics, Gestalt, how are symbols created, how are they created in our mind, and how are they filled with sense and meaning. So there's no existing bubble for board games, for analog games, but there are existing areas for other ways people are interacting with non-responsive material. Okay, so change the hand from the microphone. What I'm going to do with you in the next 45 minutes, I'm going to have a look at the history of board games and how the visuals evolved and how the visuals changed and how the language changed and how the whole process changed. And after that I'm going to talk about some examples that I've worked on. Okay, for quite some time board games did look like this. When we're looking at classic board games, chess, Go, Mancala, backgammon, they in many cases have a very, very clear visual geometric structure. There are of course masterfully crafted board games for kings, for the church, not so much, but for higher people. But many games are quite simple in their structure, and the idea behind that is that they have had to be easy to reproduce. If you want to play Mancala, you need a few holes in the sand, some beans or some stones, and you can play the game. So people had the chance to recreate those games in an easy way. They are by no meaning without a theme. They even have quite heavy themes, like Pachisi, for example, which evolves around the life, reincarnation, the death, how you have to accept luck and randomness in your life. So there is theme, and they are sometimes, or they have been sometimes, even spiritual experiences, but visually they had to be easy to reproduce. It all changed when print happened. There is a collection in the UK that has board games with the this game of goose, snakes and letters, snakes and letters, structure for about a range of 300 years. So for 300 years, games used one structure, one underlying gameplay structure, and only changed their visual appearing. So we always have this roll the die, move your pawn from one space to another and see what happens. That's it, that's the game mechanism. And it lasted, or it's existing for 300 years, which is quite a lot. But with print it was easy to reproduce, and they started putting and pasting different themes on those mechanisms. We have those goose games for traveling, for Jules Verne stories. We have them for different countries, different lands, for educating children, whatever. Here we have an example for a Finnish mythology that was recreated by using this structure. The nice thing here is that they used this wooden theme and wooden components or wooden pictures to create a story and the feeling for those different pictures. But it was always the same: roll the die, move, and that's it. After World War II, something happened. People suddenly had more time. The whole society was heading towards more free time, more holidays, and more consuming stuff. And in that period, a lot of board games looked like the older board games, but they used new and innovative mechanisms. So they had a familiar look. They often used plastic. They often used those game boards that look like chess, for example. But designers were arising and taking existing components and rearranging them, rethinking them, and redesigning games. But visually, they were quite clear and a departure from what we've seen here. Okay, and then we take a huge step forward to the late 70s. I think we could say that it all started in 1978 with the first, 78, 79, with the first time that the Spiel des Jahres was given to a board game. Who knows the Spiel des Jahres? Game of the Year from Germany. It's the most important award. And the jury, they wanted to strengthen the board gaming community and strong the board game and the culture of board games. So they decided to take one game a year, and yeah, that's the Spiel des Jahres, and this game, the sales are increasing and stuff like that. So it's not always the best game, but it's in many cases the most popular game. And by this award, they somehow kick-started a trend that publishers used what they called for quite some time the German games. Now it's called Euro games, which is much more fitting, but it originated in Germany, and I'm going through some of these examples so that you see what the visuals did back then. Suddenly games started to look friendly, inviting, and they did not only look like that, they were as well gameplay-wise friendly and inviting. We had no player elimination, we have no direct conflict, and all these things that were or that rooted in the gameplay were visually there as well. And the brilliant thing was, for example, here Settlers of Catan, that if you have the material and if you have the components and you know that those streets, those sticks, they have to lie between those hexes because that's the only space where they would fit, then you see in the next step, yeah, sure, we have these hexes, and if we put those streets there, there's still room for something. And what is this? Okay, we have the settlements, and the settlements become cities. They are bigger than the settlements, so they have to bring you more income. So many things that are in the rules are visible and feelable and tangible in the components as well. So some of the rules, they may have to be explained, but they are somehow already visible in the material. Another example, Carcassonne which is absolutely brilliant in terms of how the design shows you what to do. If you have the game at home and if you have someone who has never played Carcassonne, put the components on the table and they start to puzzle. There is the paragraph in the rule book that says roads have to be connected to roads. Cities have to be connected to cities. You don't need those rules. The rules are implied into the material. It's absolutely clear when someone gets those components that they start to puzzle and to build this landscape. Quick footnote, I worked on a game called Isle of Skye a couple of years ago, which uses this tile laying mechanism, but you don't have to connect the roads in the game. So a road can lead into a mountain. Players hated it, they are still hating it, and they still have problems keeping that rule in mind because it's so counterintuitive. It's not implied in the material that the roads can lead into the mountains or into the sea or whatever. So it's the perfect example as an opposite to Carcassonne, what happens if you have to, because it was really important that the roads don't have to be connected, but it highlights how important the visuals are, that they guide you through how the components have to fit together. Okay, I came into the business around 2007 with the game Agricola, and between the years before and after these two things, something happened. Games became more and more complex, and this was on one hand because designers evolved and designers tried to cram more and more gameplay into the game itself. But on the other hand, it was only possible because we had the chance to work digitally. We had the chance to participate in quite iteration-heavy processes. Normally, I get a prototype by the publisher, which is paper, cut out, whatever, or a PDF, and then I start making drafts for the layout, making drafts for some cards, and then I send it back. Okay, and they give me, well, feedback, how it looks and what I should change, and so on and so forth. So these complex games would not have been possible without the internet. Back in those days, it was more like Doris, who illustrated the game. She visited Hans im Glück in Munich. They talked about the game. She went home. She took 2 or 3 weeks to draw the components, probably went back by train or sent them the drafts by postal service and got feedback 1 or 2 times, and that's it. So it was not possible to communicate in such a quick and direct way a couple of years earlier, but now we have this, and therefore the games are becoming more and more complex, and the visuals, they can keep up. Okay. One thing that I noticed when looking back at the time is that games became more complex, but they didn't become more complicated. Some of them, of course, but not all of them. And the idea behind that is, I call it bottleneck design. Designers and graphic designers as well try to enable complex gaming, but they try to bring everything through a bottleneck. I'll give you an example. Worker placement. Worker placement works like this. You have a piece, a wooden piece or a plastic piece that you can put on an action field. And then you execute whatever this action field tells you to do. So the idea is, before I place the worker, I think a lot. What do I want to do? And the actual activity, the procedure I have to do is quite simple. I take my pawn and I put it on the spot. And then I can look what the spot does Hopefully I've thought about it before, but it opens another array of possibilities. So that's the thing that designers are doing and that graphic designers should do it as well. To have a look at how can we make those procedures as easy as possible. Take the pawn, put it there. So the rule explanation is quite simple, but the execution and what you have to think of is quite complex. And worker placement is one quite good example. Yeah, right now I think I called it Age of Storytelling. That's where we are now, I think, I hope. We now have a tool set. We have a tool set of visuals, we have a tool set of mechanisms, of things that work, of things that, well, do not work that well. And now designers are starting to, back in the 90s, there were two design directions, the storyteller and the clockmaker. The clockmaker always had the mechanism first, designed the game and then thought of the theme. The storyteller, he had a theme he wanted to retell by creating a game and then created the mechanisms through that. I think that now the storytellers have really their tool set to think of themes they want to play, they want to talk, they want to design about, and then they can create games using mechanisms on one hand. On the other hand, they can use iconography, they can use things that we are quite familiar with. For example, where we have it here, you see those running feet. This might, experienced board gamer might know, okay, it has to have to do something with moving. Here we have arrows, here we have numbers and arrows pointing the down and up, so it might be a reference. So experienced board gamers might have an idea what's happening without reading the rules. So this clearly indicates that some sort of common language might have evolved over the years, but it's not for everyone. I mean, this is not an example for, or these are not examples for a game that you can put in front of someone who never played a board game and he or she will understand what's happening. So there is a language, it seems, but it's a very narrow group that is aware of this. Okay, so that's a quick history from really geometric games to story and theme on the same mechanism over and over again. Then moving on to games that are more designer games, German games, Euro games, and now the tool set of story, the tool set of mechanisms and visuals that we can use to create games. Okay, so far any questions? Just because there is now a cut and I'm going to talk about some examples. Okay, if not, I'll move on. Okay. I've only picked games I've worked on because then I can tell you why I did things the way I did or we did. Illustrating board games, designing the graphics for a board game, it's always a process where only a couple of people are involved. We're not talking about big video game productions where hundreds of people on different continents are working together and are working on very small parts. We have very, very small teams. We have an editor, we have a graphic designer, illustrator, we have the author, the designer, him or herself, who is a different amount involved depending on the company and on the game. And these 4 or 5 or 6 people are working together to create the game. So it's a really small team. Yes. First, Grand Austria Hotel is a game about managing a hotel in Vienna. It's full of cliches, but it's a game I get quite positive feedback, not only on the game itself, but also on the visuals. And I wasn't aware of that while doing the game, because it was, one of many projects. But the thing that's happening here visually, and why it's visually appealing to people, is what I did here is I tried to take the different components and the different things you have to do when it's your turn and put them into frames and some text, put it into comic form. Why did I do that? The game tells a story visually and gameplay wise. It's not completely perfect, but it's one of the better examples where a Euro game, where a German game is quite story heavy on the mechanic level. What you see here is on top, that's a game board. There are different cards, and you can pick one of those cards and bring it to your own hotel. So then the general is sitting in front of your hotel. I show you the components later, and you have to bring him some food, wine, coffee, strudel, or cake. So all the cliches are there. And when he has eaten enough, he wants to have a room where he can sleep, and that's it. So we have this story. You get him, you bring him to your hotel, you serve him the meals, and then you have to make the room ready, and you have to get him to the room. So that's the story behind it. And the thing that worked here quite well is the different components we have. So we have a central game board that is a public place. So it indicates this is a public place. Every player has to do something here. It has a wide perspective, and on these white tables there the cards are placed and the different guests you can hire. Then we have one central board, which is this one, and here it's a little bit sloppy executed, because even though it's one hotel reception, every player can do something there. That's not perfect, but it's otherwise it's quite a good approach, because the different actions you can do are illustrated and are visualized in a way that they make sense. So for example, if you want to make a room ready, which you can see below, room ready making means that you take one tile and put it on such a spot. On the tile pictured is the door open. So it's clear that now the door is open, now someone can go in there. Who is going in there? The general, because he is sitting at a table with on a red table, so he wants to have a red room. Yeah, that's German game or Eurogame stuff. So the room is open, and when you serve him his meal, he goes into the room, you flip the tile, and you have this sign that you put on the doorknob, which says, "Please do not disturb." So the story of the mechanism fits perfectly to the illustrations. And that's not my achievement. That's achievement of the designers, because they thought while designing the game of how can we make this specific process visible in a game and visible gameplay wise. And if designers do that, then it's quite easy to create visuals, to create a visual language, a visual environment that reflects that. Okay, as I mentioned, the game is not perfect in that term, because we have some very abstract mechanisms as well, but this particular action, you have this action field here where you see all the keys and the sheets to make the room ready. So that's the action field you have to go if you want to make a room ready. But it's a perfect example for how those different areas, designing a game, illustrating a game, designing the visuals, are interconnected and should be interconnected. Another one, another example is when designers, the same designers as before, create a game and create mechanisms without a theme. The game is called Masters of Renaissance, Lorenzo, the card game, and it has this mechanism where you collect resources, and you have to put them in your storage. And there is a limitation to the storage. You have 3 spots. In the first row you can keep one resource, in the second one you can keep 2 resources, and in this third one you can keep 3 resources. So it's completely abstract, there is no story behind it. But what we did is, it's just a small detail, we put it in this environment, in this structure, in this stone structure that indicates, okay, the upmost spot is the smallest one, so only one can be there. And then it's getting bigger and bigger. It's just a small detail that can bring, or that can visualize rules in a way that's not too direct. So I don't have to write here maximum 1, maximum 2, maximum 3. I picture those marbles that you can put there, they represent resources, and I use the architecture to support the idea of the space is changing. So it should, in the best way, or the thing we're aiming for is to include rules into the material, so the players do not need to know them, and they don't, or they do not even have to know that this is a rule, because the material already implies it. A similar thing we've done here for Pergamon, which is already an older game for Eggertspiele, about the Pergamon Museum. And the designers came up with a theme, and part of the game is that you have to puzzle together different artifacts. We could have done them, or there were in the original prototype, there were square pieces that you simply put next to another. So what we did here is we gave them a shape, and a shape that does 2 things. It's somehow puzzly, so you get players get the impulse to put them together, and this shape also includes a thematic aspect, because we're talking about artifacts, we're talking about broken things. So it's logical that the tile itself looks like a broken thing. And if we have a look at the components, you see here in the rendering, you see that those shapes combined with the illustrations, they lead automatically to the fact that you have to puzzle them together. You have to find things and pieces and artifacts that fit together, and that's part of the game. So it's a small detail. It's production-wise no problem, but it brings some more theme into the whole thing. One other technique, I really am astounded that it's such a young thing. I'm not sure if Terra Mystica was the first, but I've worked on a game 2 years ago that uses it as well. So I call it temporally covered information. The idea behind it is that at the beginning of the game, you have your player tableau, and you put all the pieces you have on a defined spot. And they cover information. Information you do not need at the moment. Information that you need exactly in the moment when you take the piece and put it on the game board. And it's absolutely brilliant because it's simple and it feels natural. So when I take one of those pieces, or more of those pieces, probably at the end of the game it looks like this, they uncover information. And they uncover the information exactly at the right moment. For example here, when I produce 8 grain, and I can use those grain to brew whiskey or to bake bread. If I have cows, I can make cheese. So the connections, the interconnections and the rules are visualized in a way that feels natural. So that's something that we see more and more. And to be honest, it's really one of the best things. Here we have scythe, which uses this technique as well. And yeah, here we have Terra Mystica, which might be the prominent example. Tells you what you have to pay to build the building, and then you take it and then you see what your new income is. And that's absolutely brilliant, which I've said now several times. Okay. Yeah, in the same direction, that's quite a new game I've worked on, Orléans Stories, a follow-up to Orléans. And when I played the game with the designer in summer, it consisted of different hexes where the landscapes were on. And during the game, you can build a town or a village. And if you build the village, then the landscape doesn't create more resources. And he realized it by putting another piece on it, and then on the village you could build a church and stuff like that. It was very interconnected, and from the handling side it wasn't perfect. So what we did in the end was we have a fixed game board, and we have those landscape tiles. I'm coming to the shape a little bit later. And when you build a village, what you do is you flip the tile. Then it's clear that the landscape no longer is producing resources, and furthermore, you have the space for the church. It's a good example for the power of cardboard. Even though cardboard does not respond, even though cardboard is static, we can work with the form, and we can work with the two sides, with the two states that we have. We could work with the rotation of cardboard tiles. So even though it's a static and old material, we can do a lot of things. And then you see, landscape tiles still bring resources. Villages, we have spaces for churches, but we have in both states, we have still these spots below, and they are for fortifications. So that's the idea behind it, to change state in a quite natural way, turn it around, and by turning around we can present a completely new layout and a completely new functionality. And here's a quick sidestep to the whole thing of iconography. We used the city pawn from Settlers of Catan for a church because it perfectly fits. When designing board games, visually, we have to think about the way we use icons. And the best way is always to use icons in a way that is already familiar for the players. So if we talk about a church, we probably take this shape, we probably use a cross. So yeah, search for church icon or church iconography and you will find these things. And even if you ask 5 different people, draw a church, the outcome will be quite similar. So there is some common ground, some cultural ground we can look at. Do I still have time? Yeah, okay. Another one is Yangtze from Piatnik by Rainer Knizia. And we got the prototype, and it was a prototype where you had the river Yangtze, and on the river those goods were transported. And those goods were represented by cards. And each turn you had the option to take one of those cards, and you had to push the others back and bring one new card in. And it wasn't fun at all, because the handling of the game was terrible. Those card shifting was a mess, and it was really hard to execute. So what we came up is, or were two possibilities. One was this I don't know how you call it, where it's not so straight, but it's going down there, and you can put the pieces in. And the other one was the idea that we we stole from another game, Niagara, which won the Spiel des Jahres award a couple of years ago, where you have those plastic discs and the boats on the discs, and you push in the discs at the back, and they are floating. It looks like they are floating, the boats, and we use this for the game, and that's the result. So we have a 2-layer game board, and instead of the cards we have those discs, and if you take one of the discs, you simply grab it, take it out, take a new one and push it in there. So we changed the material to enable a game flow, and we changed the structure and the layout to enable a game flow that is that was much better. It's still not a great game, but it's not hindered by the use of the cards. Okay, yeah, and we're coming close to the end. Here we have a Newton game that was heavily criticized for its visuals because it was so brownish and not colorful. But while designing the game, it's about traveling through medieval or late medieval, early newer times, Europe, and inventing things. While we designed the game, we tried out a lot, and it didn't work because it's such an icon-heavy game. There's so many different icons and functions and connections that we had to reduce the color and the visuals to a level where it's becoming well, playable. And for the setup, mostly for the setup, we used different shapes for different things. For cities, for universities, it doesn't matter. It's on an abstract level, but we use different shapes, so the setup is becoming easier. A thing we can do with cardboard. So if we have the shape and you have the spot that fits to the shape, and we're humans are quite good at pattern recognition. You know, this tile has to go here. That's the spot for the circles. That's the spot for the universities. And those one with the arrow, you see it in the upper right corner. You put it on the right spot, and the arrow points toward it, and it's the end game condition tile. So what we have here is a clear visual structure that helps you set up the game, but it has no real thematic meaning. The same here. Welcome to Walnut Grove. Just a small detail. There are spots where you can put coins or cubes. What we did is we simply put those two forms or signs or shapes together. Even though the square is not the same as a cube, we know, okay, if there's a square, maybe a cube might have to be placed there. Okay, and another one, a riverboat. The tricky thing with the central game board, you see these great black squares or rectangles. Those were punched out. In the original prototype, players did put their workers at those spaces, but the problem was that those workers all have the same color. They still have the same color because they come out of a common pool, and you have to put them there. And while playing the game and the prototype, it always happened that someone pushed their pieces over there and someone pushed their pieces over there. So we had to think of a way how to get some form of structure where those pieces stay where they belong. And we did this by punching out those pieces. You can put them in there, and it's not so easy to shuffle them around. Okay, so board game visuals are, I hope that that's coming out. It's not just about painting things and creating icons. It's also about thinking about the material and what you can do with the material. With the boats below here, it's not really necessary, but we have those round holes, and you can put the riverboats in there. You don't really need it for the game, but there's a hole, and there's a round thing, so players automatically know, okay, I have to put it here. Agricola, the first game I did, we redesigned it 10 years later probably, and what you see here is a trend that's quite important and it's quite good, is that you picture or try to picture something close to the actual material. In the original version, I think it's already the second edition, the first one was even worse. We have so much text. We described things with text. And there's a limit to what icons can do, but in this case we changed it to fitting more to the actual material. We changed from one edition to the other. In the first edition we had discs for the different resources, so we used the disc, the shape, and put a symbol in there. But in the new editions we switched to shaped wooden pieces, and now we picture them. And it's getting more intuitive, more natural. And what we did as well, or what the designer did, he named the fields. The original fields, they had a theme below them with the illustration, but it's 1 clay, 3 wood, 1 reed. Now we have a forest. What do you do in the forest? You get wood. We have the clay pit. What do you get in the clay pit? You get the clay. And we have the reed bank and the fishing, and they are even connected. So it's getting, the visuals are supporting the functions. It's not that it jumps into your face. You sometimes have to look around it, but it's connected. It tells a story. It tells a story that we have something with water, and those fields connected to water in one way or another are next to each other. Okay. Yeah. Last but not least, I'm going to make a quick step back to the first slide with the arrow. When we talk about visuals and the visual language and how icons, and how things are affecting players and guiding players through the game, we always, that's the church example, we always have to keep in mind how a specific sign evolved and changed over the years and how people are reading signs. And quite an interesting example is the arrow. The arrow originated in, or the arrow was firstly an icon for war, for attack, for peace if broken, probably for love, the arrow through the heart, but it wasn't an icon for direction. The arrow became connected to direction and movement in the 18th century. So the icon, the arrow, as we have him now, everywhere around us, guiding us through buildings, guiding us through games, is quite young. First it was a finger pointer, and then with more and more industrialization, it sometimes became 18th century symbol for direction. And when you look below at the different examples, you see that the arrow in board games is prominently used, and it's used in many different ways. We have, for example, we have here arrows that tell us, okay, take these things and convert them to something else. We have the arrows here which tell us, okay, we have movement, and the movement is costing coins. We have here arrows, if you don't know the rules, you don't know what they mean. They mean if you move the bluish or the yellow cube down, then you get 4 coins. Here we have the arrow from Newton, which tells you if you have those books, then you can proceed. Here again, 2 coins can be converted 1 time. There's even a number in there to make a player piece move to another spot. And here, take something out, take something in, take some cubes. So the arrow in games is used in many different ways. And here's one example that I really like. It's not a game I worked on, but it's one that when I saw it, I was like, wow, that's brilliant. There are 3 resources in the game, and they can be combined in any way. And they bring you something. And they put little circles in the corners, and they somehow guide you through the process of how you can combine them in any possible way. But if you put them together, you see, okay, yellow and yellow makes something yellow, blue and blue makes something blue, and red makes something red. Only thing they could have done to make it even more clearer is if they have not pictured the whole circle, but only a half. Then it would have been even clearer that they have to come together to create something. But it's quite brilliant in the way they pictured it. Okay, we're at the arrow. I had the slide in the beginning talking about the different disciplines we could look at when talking about board game visuals. And one I really like is wayfinding. There's a lot of literature on wayfinding, there are great books on wayfinding, and we have to work with wayfinding every day when we go through a city, when we go through a public building. And it's a great starting point to think about iconography, to think about how to guide players through a game. And in wayfinding, there are different kind of icons one can use. And those icons can be found in board games as well. We have icons of identification. For example, the blue corners here, they tell us that's a card for the blue player. We have directional icons that show us the direction, which is something we have to define. We have orientation. In this case, the card is two-sided, so we know this is side A, and we know when we turn the card around, it is side C, which is another function. And we have then icons that regulatory, it's called in wayfinding, but I would call it functionality, how the actual effect of a specific piece is visualized. So we have some language here that we can probably map on board games to create a language that we can use to talk about icons, iconography. And here's an example. 2 victory points for each house. How can we picture that? And there are many ways we can do that. Some are better, some are not really the way we would like to have it. For example, the arrow nowadays means it's transformed, so I have to give a house away to get 2 victory points. I'm not sure. What does this mean? What does this mean? Do I want to use language? So that's an indication that on one hand we have some sort of language regarding icons, but it's still different from game to game. And it's evolving and it's changing, and hopefully designers, illustrators are coming up with great new ideas to picture things even clearer and to create a way that is understandable and readable. And players don't have to learn the language each time they play a game. So we won't get around to think about the design process, not only create the game, create the prototype, give it to the publisher, and the publisher with the graphic designer and the illustrator is creating the game. We have to start, it already started, but we have to expand on the idea that we work together in those small teams I talked about from the beginning of the process. We have to think about how our pieces moved on the table, how are those components that I can touch arranged, and how do they interact with each other and interact with the player, even though they are not interactive in a way we usually think of. So components, rules, the procedures as I talked about, and the theme and the players, all this is interconnected, and designers and illustrators have to think about that. And I think that's what I wanted to say. So, some pictures from Agricola, from the new version where we tried to fix some things that we did wrong in the first edition. Okay, thank you for your attention, and now it's time for questions.
Thank you, Franz. Okay. Maybe I'll kick off the question round. What I find interesting is that you show quite clearly how your work is trying to make a sort of translation from the work of the designer, who makes all the rules, who makes all the mechanics, and you try to intermediate with the player. Does it happen a lot that while you are creating the visuals and the components, that the player, the story of the games changes, that the designer comes back and plays what you made and says like, oh, this is not entirely what I had in mind, but maybe it's a different direction, since it's more of an iterative process?
Yes and no. More no than yes. Yes, designers rethink some aspects of the game, mostly in terms of handling. How components are touched, how components are shifted over the place, because they see, okay, that's how you picture it. I have an idea how we can make it even easier to include this rule or this procedure. It happens, but it happens not a lot, and it depends strongly on the designer. Some of them have quite brilliant prototypes that I only have to rework a little bit, and others have really raw prototypes where I can start from the scratch. But it's not happening as often as I would wish for. Regarding for example, the Austria Hotel game, there are, as I mentioned, brilliant combinations of mechanism and story, but there are some weak spots as well. And the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is, that reviewers and players quickly identify those spots. They say, okay, this is something that's not feeling natural. Gameplay-wise, we know why it's there, but the theme and the execution is not 100% what we expected. And it's especially strong in Austria Hotel because some of the parts are as good as they are, and others are not.
So you would like to have more of a collaborative process with the designers. Is that what you prefer?
That would be the perfect situation, but then we would need, of course, more time to make those games. That's another thing, that there is, in many cases, quite a tight time frame from the finished prototype to the finished game, and there's not always time to communicate in that extensive level.
Can you give us an idea of how tight this time frame is? How long are you working on?
I've done games in 2 weeks, from getting the prototype to the printing data, and I've worked on games for half a year. But normally, the core time is about 4 to 6 weeks. But then the game should be already finished gameplay-wise. From the moment I get, okay, Klemens, start, please. We need the data in about 2 months. 2 months, I would say, is realistic. But there are many cases, and it's getting better. I have to say it's getting better, and it always depends on the publisher. Some are extremely on short term. In summer, when there is enough work, Klemens, we need a board game in a couple of weeks. Can you do it? It always depends on the publisher. There are publishers where I say no, we won't manage to do it. And there are others that let me do my work, and then we might be able to do it.
And you talked about every board game developing its own visual language.
Yeah.
Like, do you playtest that? Like, what's your role in the playtesting procedure? Do you you collaborate with the game designers on the playtesting process, and you see what playtesters say, or do you playtest just the visual language on its own?
Everything is possible. There's I had a game in the last year, New Dale for Lookout Games, where I was heavily involved in the whole process, in the whole prototyping process, where we played different iterations, where we took quite some time to develop it, and sometimes there are games where I just have to find a language that I hope fits the understanding of the player. So it's always in board game business is extremely. It's not one way how things are done. There are many different ways, many different companies, many different editors, many different designers, and it's always a unique project and always a unique approach. But there are projects where I'm involved strongly, and that's always fun.
So maybe a question regarding that. Imagine that, yeah, you don't have a lot of time and you feel, okay, I have to do this in a very limited time frame. I don't know the game very well. Isn't that not a reason sometimes to say, no, I don't want to do it? Are you not afraid of putting something out there that is maybe going to even damage your reputation then?
I've done that.
Right.
I've done that. It depends on the editor. If I trust the editor and I know what he's doing, then I can rely on that. For example, I've just done a visual update for Watergate, Frosted Games, and the editor Victor, who is a brilliant editor, he handed me the prototype, and it was finished, nearly finished, and I had a 2-week job for me, and I could completely rely on the iconography he did. I just made it a little bit prettier. Agricola, for example, I'm still amazed that it worked out because I have never played it before doing the illustrations, so I completely trusted myself to Uwe Rosenberg's prototype, and I stick quite close to his original layout because it was so clear, it was well thought, and you can judge that. After a couple of prototypes you see, okay, that will work or that won't work, but that was the first game and I trusted him, and we made a lot of mistakes in the game, but you learn with every mistake. But there are projects where I already said no, not in the time, because it's too complex, and I already made mistakes. For example, one of the biggest mistakes, or the biggest backfiring we got, was the Guilds of London game, which has these cards with different functions, many different, and they wanted to have it language independent. And it was a level where I should have said, that's too much. We cannot picture that much in a visual language without players having to learn it. And in the game is a two-sided A4 sheet that you need to learn to understand the cards. That was a mistake. People like the game. If you play it 1 or 2 or 3 times, you get the iconography, but it's not self-explaining. So that was probably a mistake, but it was the wish of the publisher. That's always well, the publisher's paying your bills. So sometimes if they say, I want to have the pink, blue border around my card for a game that's about World War II, and you can say, okay, probably we shouldn't because it's not fitting. And if they say, no, we insist, then they insist. So I'm not seeing myself as an artist, but I'm in service. I give them a specific graphic design service. That's what I do.
You talked a little bit about the cost of visual language in war games, how it evolved to what it is now. Any thoughts on the future?
Well, I don't really believe in combined games where digital devices become a prominent part, because in most cases gamers do not like it. Publishers have tried it a lot and gamers do not like it. They work when they focus on those procedures I was talking about. Including digital devices makes sense when they do things that are too complicated for the players to execute. Like in the Alchemist game, I don't know if who knows the game. You make a photo of the combination you think might be correct, and then the app gives you the feedback. It can be executed by a game master, but it's no fun. It's just one, okay, I make the click, I look at it, okay, now I can rearrange my combination. That's a perfect example where digital devices do work. They work as a timer quite well. But I don't think the future lies there. Visually, I don't think that we will get one language for board games, but we get different dialects for different games. Especially, I work a lot with lookout games, so I can use the same icons in there every time. You can say it's sloppy. You can say I should create a new one every time I create a game. But I take the opportunity I have there to reuse the icons to make players feel familiar when opening the game, so they know what they're diving into, especially when it's a specific or similar game, like the Uwe Rosenberg games all have a similar iconography. That's not just because of the designers. In many cases it's Dennis Lohausen. In the beginning it was me. It's because Uwe has a very, very clear vision of how those things should be pictured, and he's very good at that. So there are dialects evolving, I would say. And other than that, I don't know. I mean, the thing with the temporarily covered information, it's extremely easy if you see it, but it took quite some time for us to get there. So I'm not sure what this old material that we have cardboard, we have wood, old material that we know for such a long time, and it still manages to surprise me in many games. And that's fascinating because it's old, but it hasn't reached its limits. There's still well, some new areas where we can go.
So, assuming you have enough time, you're not like super stressed on time, where do you start? Where you start designing a game? Do you start very much thinking, okay, I have obviously components from the prototype. Do you start with the iconography? Do you start with the drawing? Do you start, like, for instance, the game board? How are you gonna divide all that and think of sizes of things? Because that's, for instance, something I always think about is how big does everything have to be, yes and no, and how much room do we need? And how do you sometimes evolve if you think, yeah, maybe I have a limited space. How do I avoid it being just, a clusterfuck of icons and being something a bit coherent that's nice to look at? Because the Grand Austria style, as you said, it's nice because there's a story being told, so that helps. How do you manage to, start on that?
Okay, if I have enough time,
Yes.
how do I start? I generally like to start with to look at the game, to play the game, and to get an idea what the central component of the game is. Is it the cards, or the player board, or even a tile, a small tile? What is the central component? And I focus on that component. I try to get there as far as possible, because if everything else evolves around that component, then I have a good starting point. If it's a card game, okay, what size of cards do I need? There are some standard sizes, and if I have to put the cards on the game board, then I already have a size for the game board. Then I have to look, okay, what sizes do we have? What can we get in the box? and how much space do I have between the cards that are lying on the game board? Is enough room for illustrations? Is enough room for space? But I love to start with one of the components, get it really far, so the publisher sees where we are going. That's really important, because the best thing would be if I could deliver a finished game to the publisher, and then they say, okay, this has to change. But that's not possible, because for every iteration a complete game would be a lot of work. So I try to take one key component and build everything around it. Yeah, that's the way I normally do it. And it's always good to know the budget in the background. That's the other thing. What's the budget? What do we have for production? What is possible? Because I don't always can do what I want to do, and that's really a bummer. But it's the way it is. So and then I try to cramp in as many features as possible within the given budget. Does it help?
Yeah, it does. With Guilds of London, you talked about that the language independence, which was like something you would advise against because it was just too much. Are there other examples from like publishers or designers that want specifically something in the game that you would advise against?
Yeah, the language thing is always, the icon thing and the language thing is always troubling. Because if possible, I would like Guilds of London. It would have been great if we have a small text box below it, but it's always a cost question. Other things, component-wise, well, there are discussions about the shapes of rune components. It's always Expedition to New Dale. From Lookout Games, we have the settler houses in there because you're building buildings. And at one specific point, we weren't sure about should we use the buildings because they are rather high and they might stand in front of some of the icons, or should we use flat discs. We went for the houses because thematically they make more sense, but gameplay wise and usability wise the smaller discs would have been better. So it's always a what are we aiming for? If we would have used the discs for the game, then players would have said, hey, why didn't you use the houses? So you can please everyone, but it's sometimes quite expensive. New Dale, the solution would have been to use bigger game boards. Okay, the budget only allowed A4, 2 times A4, A3 folded to get it into the box. So it's always juggling the options. But there are rarely things where I have to say it was a real mistake. It wasn't a mistake in Guilds of London, it's still working, but it would have been so much better if we have used the text and probably only some supporting icons. Not trying to picture everything through icons, but only try to use supporting icons. That would have been the best way, especially for such a card-driven heavy game.
Maybe a simple question. You're active for like a decade or so now, illustrating board games.
Excuse me.
You are working for a decade in the field of illustrating board games. Is there like sort of great lesson or takeaway that you want to give to people who want to start illustrating board games?
Don't do it. No. You're going to make every possible mistake. Because, and that's why I'm happy for the opportunity to stand here, there is no education, there is no literature. So I sometimes get, when I do only the graphic design, print preparation, I get illustrations and cards from young illustrators. They're doing illustration-wise amazing job. They're so great, but they have no idea how a game works. So when going to the board game illustration business or graphic design business, play games. watch people playing games, watch people how they interact, watch people where they have problems, listen to people when they say, okay, I don't understand that, why do I have to put it here or put it there? Yeah, playing games, making mistakes, and it's simply taking time to know all the mistakes and all the things you can stumble over. So there's no education, because it's such a small and specific field. And be prepared to work a lot, and you're not getting rich, but you're doing a job that makes people happy, and that's, oh, I'm getting emotional. Walking through a fair, seeing people having fun on a table with a game you've worked on, that's absolutely amazing. That's giving you back so much. And to making it a little bit easier for people to play the game through visuals that are clear, that are inviting, that's a great job. So if you have the opportunity, I would go for it. Mm-hmm.
So, how often do you actually talk about what you're doing with other illustrators that I'm sure face similar problems? And have you never thought about maybe we should start, I don't know, some kind of platform somewhere where we can exchange these ideas? Because like you say, there's not much or no literature whatsoever, and a guild, yeah. Start a guild.
We should do that, yes. There is in Essen and in Nuremberg, illustrators, mostly out of the German-speaking area, are sitting together drinking a beer and complaining about publishers. But yeah, if we get the momentum, if we get enough on board, why not? I mean, it only could help the industry getting better, and we are all, I mean, it's a small industry, and we're all learning from each other, and designers are taking inspiration from one another, and illustrators and graphic designers are taking inspiration, and it's very open source-y. So we should and could do that. I mean, if you're in, I'm in. So we stay in contact.
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Yeah.
So when you start a game, you obviously have a theme. How much research do you do into especially if it's a historical game, do you do into that, and how much does that influence then how you're going to draw? Because stylistically that can also, I'm sure, inspire you.
Yeah, I'm only doing medieval stereotype games because it's always a trap. If there's time, I do research. If there's a specific theme, I try to do at least a basic level of research, but we've had many examples of stepping really into a trap where you don't intend to, but you offend people. When you, when you do a game on Native Americans and you do a basic research, and there are so many different cultures and different people that you have to be really well on the watch. So many publishers are even sticking to secure themes because they don't want to step into the trap of clothing in medieval China, for example. So the best thing would be if we had professionals guiding us through a historical theme. But we're back to the budget and to the time. In a perfect world, we could do a lot of research, but in reality, it's always quite tight. But as a starting point for inspiration, it's always great. For example, I did Altiplano a couple of years ago, which is very colorful and uses some of the pattern from this area. So it's a good point to start, but you always have to be careful not hurting someone. And then there are many examples where this happened, and I know the illustrators behind those things, and those are really nice guys that don't want to hurt anyone, but it happens. And I think, on the other hand, it's really good that we are aware of those different aspects and those different cultures. But it's, again, it's always an act of balance, and if you're unsure, go back to medieval Europe. Anything else? Okay, well then,
We thank you for your time. It was very informative.
thank you for the questions. A lot of questions, I'm really happy about that. Normally it's like you're doing a talk and then no one raises his or her hand and okay, no questions. But this was really, really inspiring. Thank you very much.